Hello? Hopefully you can hear me well. I want to start by welcoming you all to this roundtable discussion called Creativity, Resistance and Change in Times of Crisis. Who is the subject speaking? In the call for the NORA conference, we are encouraged to reflect on where the potential for change can be found in a world preoccupied with borders and boundaries, and particularly what can be learned from the legacies of feminist creativity and resistance. In this roundtable, we want to approach this by discussing one of the core assumptions in what is called Strand 7, that is that new conceptions and inscriptions of the political, ethical, and epistemic subjects are urgently needed in times of natural, humanitarian, and military crisis. Noting that crisis is not a neutral term, but highly ideological, circulating widely in contemporary humanitarian discourse, we ask to whom, what, and when the term crisis speaks, and what effects the situatedness of crisis has for the conception of the subject. Humanitarian discourse risks, for example, introducing a split between the subject and the object of crisis. Is there a feminist we in of crisis, or does the term crisis in humanitarian discourse always refer to the other? That is, the poor, the migrant, the victim of war. Moreover, to the extent that crisis might refer both to us and them, is the term crisis conceived in the same way for both groups? Starting from the viewpoint that it is paramount to think through these different localities and temporalities of crisis in order to think how change can or occur, we will also discuss who are the political, ethical, and epistemic subjects that need to be reconceptualized. From where can this reconceptualization take place? How can feminist theory be part of such a reconceptualization, if indeed such a reconceptualization is at all needed? Creativity and resistance, whether located in the artistic, the political, the academic, or the everyday field, can spring forth from all axes in a power hierarchy. Can intersectional feminism, as a critical as well as affirmative collective endeavor, help us to navigate in this highly complex terrain of power and difference? And to what extent can cross-disciplinary gender research shed new light on the interconnectivities of crisis and change? These are not small questions that we pose, so I'm very glad to be able to introduce this excellent panel that will discuss these questions. First here is Christina Jacobsen. She's a professor of social anthropology and director of the Center for Women's and Gender Research at the University of Bergen. Christina specializes in the areas of migration, religion, and gender. And she works ethnographically in Norway and southern France, and has published on topics such as feminism and multiculturalism, sex work in migration, Islam and secularism, and irregular migration. And she's currently had a 4-year research project funded by the Research Council of Norway called Waiting for an Uncertain Future, the Temporalities of Irregular Migration. And then we have Margit Istanes. She's a social anthropologist at Volda University College in Norway. Istanes has conducted ethnographic fieldwork in Guatemala and Brazil, and her current work critically investigates the use of sporting mega events as a tool for urban and economic development in Rio de Janeiro. In particular, she focuses on forced removals and the resistance against them. Miriam says I don't need to introduce her, as most of you probably have already had her introduction. So I'll listen to her and then move on to the last of our panel participants, Randi Gressgaard, who's a professor at the Center for Women's and Gender Research at the University of Bergen. And her research interests include migration and minority studies, gender sexuality studies, and urban studies. And informed by critical urban theories, she has in recent years focused on policy frames and planning for pluralism and diversity, using it as an entry point, amongst others, to discuss the foundational question, how is society possible? So I think we will be able to have a very exciting discussion here. My name is Marianne Carlsen, and I will be chairing this discussion. I am currently a postdoctoral fellow, also at the Center for Women and Gender Research at the University of Bergen, also working on irregular migration, state sovereignty, and particularly the interplay between migration control and welfare. So we will start by letting each of you comment or say a few words based on this, the abstract that we have based this roundtable on, and then we will move on from there discussing the questions that arises. So since we have one microphone, I think we're just going to continue this way by me passing it on to you.
Okay. Thank you, Marianne. I was a bit intimidated as you read out sort of our questions loud, because they're really large, and I think we're not going to be able to address all of them, but let me at least try to start some of the discussions that I'm interested in having with my co-panelists here. And I wanted to start with the question of time, because in what Marianne just read out to us from the call, the question of the subject and the subjects we need to reconceptualize is raised in relation to times of crisis now. So I wanted to start by considering what times of crisis are, and not by situating ourselves in a particular historical moment of crisis, but rather by thinking about what kinds of temporality the conception of crisis is producing, and how that is producing also particular subjects and particular ways of thinking about creativity, change, and resistance. So crisis is very often conceived as a limited period of time, which has a before and an after, right? And as such, it implies a temporal bracketing as a transition, a rupture, an exception from normal or regular time. And we see also from the formulation in Strand 7 that Marianne was reading that crisis is very often associated with urgency. So the call says that new conceptions of the subject is urgently needed, right? So we have the urgent temporal frame here, calling for action that cannot wait. So I think that the question of the temporality of the crisis is closely linked then to the question of the subject speaking, and to how we understand the possibilities for resistance, creativity, and change. And of course, at this conference, there has been several speakers stressing the need for, among other things, intersectional and post and decolonial perspectives. And I think this also prompts us to pay attention to the question of the location from which one speaks the crisis. So where is this conception of the crisis located? And I think Kim Thalberg addressed this briefly in her speak this morning. She was saying that indigenous people have been living in a post-apocalyptic world for quite some time. So that is also invoking the locatedness of the temporality of crisis that I will come back to. So I wanted to make this more concrete by relating it to my own field of research on irregular migration in Europe. So as Marianne said, we're currently doing a research project called Waiting for an Uncertain Future, The Temporalities of Irregular Migration. And as you all know, it has become quite commonplace to speak about a migration crisis in Europe. So I wanted to take that as a point of departure, because what this putative crisis of migration has been made to mean, and what this particular narrative of the recent past and present legitimizes and sanctions, I think, as a very interesting question. So we can talk about then the elisions from the recited truths of the migration crisis and which kinds of voices and counter-interpretations that are glossed over and forgotten in the dominant narratives of the migration crisis. So when we started hearing about the migration crisis, it was in relation to the washing on shore of dead black and brown bodies in the Mediterranean, and with the event of one boat that capsized in 2015, where 822 migrants drowned during the capsize. Unfortunately, as we know, this was not a singular event, but one in what proved to be a series of incidents of mass death in the Mediterranean. And to try to make it a little bit short, we had a first phase where this migration crisis was primarily conceived as a humanitarian crisis. And Miriam mentioned 2 days ago in her keynote lecture how this iconic picture of Aylan Kurdi was circulating as sort of the image of the innocent refugee child there. And of course, Miriam did a very good job at problematizing, you know, this kind of how innocence works within these humanitarian regimes and the humanitarian imaginaries. But what was interesting, of course, and I don't think you mentioned, that very short time after this iconic figure of Aylan Kurdi was transformed when the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo published a cartoon where Aylan Kurdi was portrayed as a young adult man running around in the streets and grabbing women and behaving like what you call in France a voyou, one of these unruly youths of the French suburbs, right? And this was right after the events that took place in Köln, where sort of there was a dramatization of sort of the incipient threat of migrant men to Europe and to sort of ideals of gender equality, etc. So Aylan Kurdi was transformed in the course of very few weeks from the innocent child washed up onto our shores to this potential future threat for Europe. So I think that's interesting, and it's a figure of how the imagery of crisis around the migration crisis as a humanitarian crisis shifted very quickly to a crisis of the border, of securitizing the border, of keeping out the criminal migrant, the illegal migrant, the potential terrorist threat that it was very quickly linked to. So the whole imaginary shifted, and it became a crisis of the whole social body of Europe, in a sense. How many refugees could Europe tolerate? What would it lead to? What kind of crisis in the social body of Europe would it produce? So, of course, this is very significant, these shifting imaginaries of the crisis, for how we think about, you know, the subject and how we think about the forms of creativity and resistance that can take place. There was, among some European scholars, an effort to shift the debate and to start rather talking about this is not a crisis of migration, but a crisis of hospitality. So some French scholars very quickly suggested it's a crisis of hospitality, and relating to the whole French philosophical tradition of speaking about hospitality. And then others followed up saying it's a crisis of solidarity, etc. So, and it's very interesting because that again sort of shifts the subject and sort of the challenge that we're facing with this kind of crisis. So it becomes an ethical challenge to forge new relationships of solidarity and hospitality with migrants in the migrant situation. But it's still basically about Europe. So the us of the crisis is still basically about Europe. It's Europe facing the crisis. So I think it's interesting if when we shift in our project to the perspective of, or trying to see the crisis with the undocumented migrants as they inhabit Europe and as they inhabit sort of this migration crisis, what happens to it? And what happens, of course, is that from that perspective, the crisis is not sort of this exception or this sort of rupture of normal time. It's much more a chronic crisis. So that the crisis is, in a sense, is the context in which people navigate and forge their lives. And then again, to relate that back to what Kim Thalberg was saying this morning, that in some locations, crisis is endemic. It is the context in which people move and act and live their lives. It's not something that is passing and that you will deal with by sort of trying to fix it or amend it. So that leads us to other ways of thinking about the subject and the political, ethical, and epistemic subject that is being addressed in the call for this stream. What options does it leave us with? And I'm thinking here about, for instance, the writings of Hassan Haj about the stuckedness and about waiting it out as a sort of a new way of inhabiting crisis rather than trying to agitate for change or for normalization or reconfiguration. So I think it raises very interesting questions about the subject and about the idea of the need or the urgent need for a new kind of subject and what that should be. Now did I talk for a long time or just, gonna be very quick. I have so much to say. Just a couple of more things that I wanted to address, or at least one more thing, I guess, is that in much of migration studies, but also beyond, the irregular migrant is now sort of being hailed as a potential political and ethical subject that can be the grounds for producing a kind of change. So in a sense that they're sometimes figured as this new subject that we're calling for, that you know, is invoked here. And I think that is something that's very interesting to discuss. In a sense, Miriam's sort of presentation touched about the possibility, at least, of new political subjects emerging within the frames of, for instance, refugee camps or encampments that are self-organized. But I also think that there are immense challenges with sort of the effort to locate this new political and ethical subject in those spaces of chronic crisis or crisis as endemic and a context. I think it's problematic and we should discuss it. And I think maybe a more sort of radical feminist position would be to ask whether we need to reconsider the privilege of those who are citizens of nation states, and whether at all we would consider it as a viable feminist option to give up collectively our citizenship privileges in these nation states that are bordering and keeping out the rest of Europe. Yes.
Jess, thank you. I wanted to, I was also a bit intimidated when I heard all the questions you read out, Marianne, so I'm glad you also mentioned that. Yeah, well, I wanted to start by thanking the organizers and participants of this conference, because it's been really stimulating and thought-provoking, and for my own part, I've come to some, new things that I was able to see in my own work that I didn't realize beforehand. So I wanted to discuss that and bring that up as a question at this panel. So when we proposed the panel, we organized it around the idea of exploring, like, who is the subject speaking. And now, after listening to some of the speakers, I think it would also be interesting to explore, I don't know what to call it, maybe the politics of listening and seeing. And I think Miriam's keynote about innocence was really inspiring in that sense. And also I attended a panel on decolonialization that I thought was really thought-provoking in that sense. And both of these events deal with power and the willingness to see and acknowledge a problem when somebody points it out to you. So in the panel on decolonialization, some of the panelists, Oda Kanga Diallo and Teju Alisa Farrar, they talked about how white people in Europe very often refuse to acknowledge the existence of racism. When people of color say, I experience racism in here, and white people very often say, no, you don't. That's not the case. We don't have that here. And the power dynamics of that speaks to this panel, I think. And also in Miriam's keynote, she talked about how innocence and ignorance is often used to not take responsibility or to not acknowledge a problem. So I think this speaks to the question of who gets to define something as a crisis or a problem and who doesn't. And when somebody tries to say, this is a crisis, how is that received, depending on the position from which they speak. So in relation to my own work on people who were evicted from their homes in Rio de Janeiro when the city was planning to host the Olympics, I think this perspective brings into light a few things that certainly I wasn't thinking about beforehand, and I think is important to address. So the background to this is that historically favela removals have been a common feature of urban development projects in Rio de Janeiro. And I think this relates to how, as a former colony and slave society, there has been a very strong interconnection between racialized and economic inequality in Brazil. And you can see this very clearly in the urban landscape, how it's kind of inscribed with poor and rich people living in different places, but very nearby each other. So rich people are constantly, or the middle class are constantly kind of exposed to this inequality in a way that very often makes them uncomfortable. So for the elite, the visions of progress is very often focused on getting rid of this complexity in a way to remove poor people to the periphery of the city, away from central and attractive areas. And after Brazil became a democracy in 1985, this policy was largely abandoned because it was so strongly associated with the authoritarian regime. But then later, when after 2010, when Rio had been awarded both the 2014 FIFA World Cup and the 2016 Olympics, there was this, all kinds of processes were set in motion, and one of them was that favela removals were reintroduced as a policy. And I did fieldwork in Rio while this was going on, and more specifically in Vila Autódromo, which is a neighborhood located right next to where the city decided to place the Olympic Park, and they were removed while it was constructed, while the park was constructed. So residents here, they experienced the eviction as a very dramatic event, obviously. But they struggled to get this point of view recognized, in the Brazilian public. There wasn't a lot of interest in their issue, basically. And the people who were removed, they engaged in activism. They wanted to stay, and they tried very hard to stay. So there was a lot of activity going on related to that. And they focused very strongly on communicating that this was a crisis to them. So they did a lot of things to do that and I can talk more about it afterwards if there are questions about it. But what I wanted to foreground here was that one of the things they did was they created these, T-shirt designs that they would all wear T-shirts that read SOS Vila Autódromo when they were at protests or in public events and so on. So to really, phrase the situation as a crisis. However, the city administration refused to do so, and they insisted that this was more of a development intervention, in a sense. That they were lifting poor people out of the middle class by taking them out of, their self-constructed favela homes and placing them in public housing projects. So that was, their narrative, and there was a struggle of narratives there. And it's interesting that in the Brazilian public sphere, it was the official narrative that dominated. There was very little interest in the struggle of the residents to stay and in how they phrased what was happening to them. At the same time, this story got a huge international audience. So this, the struggle to stay in Vila Autódromo was featured in all kinds of media outlets abroad. It was featured in The Guardian, The Independent, ESPN, Time Magazine, Al Jazeera, and so on. And it was always phrased that this David and Goliath narrative of, a small community neighborhood in Rio that was up against the Olympic Committee, Odebrecht, and other construction companies of huge influence in Brazil, the political elites, and so on. And also, it got a lot of attention here in the Nordic region. So this situation, this lack of interest within Brazil and the huge interest outside Brazil is very often interpreted, in light of Brazil's colonial legacy of racism and class discrimination. And almost everybody who were involved in it, the residents, other, Brazilian academics, foreign academics, the media, everybody seemed to share this story. However, I think one of the things that this idea of thinking about innocence helps us see this. Another aspect to this story is that, the Brazilian they say the Brazilian media was silent because the Brazilian middle and upper classes are not interested in hearing about this story. So that's, one explanation. However, I think another one is that, the narrative of crisis that emerged from Vila Autódromo got such a big audience abroad. Maybe because it doesn't, how can I say that, to recognize that was going on doesn't really imply acknowledging that one is implicated in these structures that create racial injustice elsewhere. Like we are all implicated in it, but if we just see it somewhere else and not in our own home, then we don't implicate ourselves. And I think that's something to think about. So I think this, to just see injustice elsewhere and not in our own society is kind of, in a way, even helping us create a narrative that locates us completely outside of these structures that produce the crisis. And I think that's very problematic. And I think it's something that we really need to explore further in terms of how can we find ways of engaging in global struggles without eclipsing our own implication in them and what's going on in our own countries.
Thank you, and I want to thank my co-panelists, the Bergen crew, for inviting me, keeping open borders, and I can be an honorary Norwegian today. So I came at it partly, we each have entered through the whatever, there's a number of questions. I came at it, can there be a feminist we in the face of crisis? And my feeling is that no, there cannot be. In the face of any form of crisis, I think the subjects that are formed are always hierarchical or distinct or binary or divided. And I think in particular of Hannah Arendt's work on the idea of how humanity came into being as a collective subject, came into being in the face of the creation of the atom bomb and in the face of the destruction, the potential destruction of of the earth, but of humanity as a species. And that is the creation of a collective subject in the face of crisis. And yet, once it became a reality, or a reality if we want to claim, people started using the category and identifying as such, it also became one of the most violent regimes possible. From Carl Schmitt, whether we obviously don't agree with him, but I think his analysis was powerful in saying that only when humanity was organized as a collective subject could people be expelled from it. So I think that in the face of crisis, those are the kinds of subjects that are created in the face of crisis. I don't think anything productive can be created in the face of crisis. The other way we can think about it, Deepesh Chakrabarty has written about the category of humanity that is created in the face of the Anthropocene. And that's an entirely different category, again, with a different ontological status, which is as a force of nature. And again, that's not something that one can feel. We just don't have the capacity to feel what it means to be a force of nature. So again, I don't think crisis is a helpful way of thinking of how we can come together. So my feeling is that we need to come together, and we do need to create a new collective subject. And I agree entirely with Christina that it needs to come together not on the basis of crisis, but of everyday life and of everyday crudiness, as Beth Povinelli has said. It's just the cruddy events that aren't events. They're just pseudo. They don't quite erupt, but they're there. And I think that's the kind of thing that needs to bring us together. How we organize along things that are not events is another set of questions. And to me, again, I go back to the idea of the commons, and which I've been thinking through, because it's not an identity-based community. It's about a set of practices. And I think we can create ourselves through our practices as a collective subject. We're not there, and it'll take a long time, but nonetheless, I think it can be done. We don't have to be the same. We just have to engage together in respectful and mutual ways. Again, to the point of what you said, Christina, about migrants doing it, I don't, in the commons, it's not the migrants or anybody special who's setting it up, it's everybody. And if you're going to be part of a commons, everybody has to give up their special or privileged status, right? So hence the kind of City Plaza example where it's people living alongside migrants and citizens living together. But we can think of other commoning practices like community gardens or collective kitchens or communal housing, or creating food together. There's a number of ways I think that people can come together, and I think it's our job to be creative on that front. I agree that we don't have to wait for something. Many people are already engaging in it, and I think we do need to claim our contaminated state, not wait for a situation of innocence or purity, but claim our contamination and work from there. Michelle Murphy has a very good argument about this with her when she talks about altar politics, which is starting in the here and now and working from there. Is intersectional feminism going to help us on this? No, I don't think so. And I don't mean to say we shouldn't have an anti-racist, decolonial type of feminism, but I don't think that intersectional feminism is the way to go. And I think that is just because I think it did incredibly important work when it was proposed, but I think it creates commensurabilities and works on the basis of identities that I don't think is helpful when you don't find yourself in any of those identities or any of the intersections of those identities. It assumes in some senses they're all commensurable statuses instead of thinking that one might be this big and one might be an entirely different shape that is morphing. It doesn't allow for flow or movement or change or flexibility or permeability in the model. I think we have to think about how things come into being together, while recognizing, of course, racism and sexism and colonialism and so on. So I would think about, again, a different kind of politics based maybe on practice, not on a priori identity. So I guess my feeling is that certainly the people who are not normally engaged in creative practices need to get going on it. And I think in particular social science, I'm an anthropologist, we're not told to engage in creative practice or political imagination, we're told to engage in critique and based on empirical examples. I think the time is over for that. Not that we shouldn't engage in critique, but that we need to use critique towards imaginative ends, that we shouldn't shy away from it because other people are imagining around us. Trump is imagining a big, beautiful wall. He's using his own political imagination. I think we have to counter with equally powerful political imaginations. So I want to kind of put out the challenge that we need to be engaging in these kinds of things. I tried this year, I got with a few others, we got a grant from the Mellon Sawyer Foundation, and we created a seminar that was called Imaginative Mobilities, and it was with 2 speculative designers, 1 political theorist and myself, and we decided to think beyond borders. What could we imagine? What could we create? You know, we thought about, we had artists and architects and designers and so on, but what if you work from now and where there are borders, how else could you reimagine, reconstruct them? It was really difficult, and I don't have good answers, but it did push me to imagine on different scales and in different ways, and I think we can all do that.
Okay, I will continue in this vein because I have been thinking a lot recently about not only imagination but also feminist theorizing around the future, and the notion of imagination is part of that. So my starting point is that many recent feminist debates, scholarly debates that is, take as their starting point that we live in uncertain times. So uncertainty is kind of the starting point, which means that the future is unimaginable in the sense of being unpredictable. We cannot wait for the future because the future is unknowable to us. It's not inscribed in the present, so we cannot predict what the future holds. So you can always hope for change, but what you hope for more specifically remains uncertain. So in other words, you may imagine a different future, but that future is quintessentially unimaginable. So the desire to see change is then fundamentally detached, or at least in some sense detached from a particular view of the future, or especially if you compare to the old modernist fantasies of the future as, the future as one. Such a fantasy is bound to be disillusioning, like Beckett's figures in Waiting for Godot, whose optimism about the future is incapacitating. So those who wait for their redeemer to arrive on the scene wait in vain in Beckett's play. But more importantly, in this context, the waiting game that unfolds reveals the fundamental lack of any theology of development. So it reveals the failure to establish certainties about time, place, and identity. The failure of sociality, which of course speaks to the fundamental question of the social sciences: how is society possible? I'm not going to go further into that, but then again, we need to ask, how can one imagine a different world without hoping or waiting for a specific future world which is inscribed in the present? And much of feminist debates, especially in critical feminist scholarly debates, many of them revolve around this tension, or maybe we should call it a knot, between imagining possible alternatives on the one hand, and through reconceptualizations or theoretizations, opening up for the unimaginable possible beyond specific alternatives. So you have this tension going on all the time, more or less explicit, running through these debates. How can we imagine, or how can we imagine possible alternatives, and at the same time not being concrete about this, not closing down the debate and limit the horizon of possibilities. So I think, and I think also many of these debates touch upon the tension that Miriam, or the relationship that Miriam mentioned, the relationship between the event, the radical event, and the pseudo event, the extraordinary and the ordinary. So I think we have some, we have certain framing here that we need to discuss further, I think, in order to move forward in, this kind of to use critique towards imaginative ends, to use your formulation. Thank you.
Thank you for those thought-provoking initial comments. So now we are, I was thinking to give the opportunity to sort of comment a bit on each other, and if there are things that you thought of during each other's short introductions, and then after a while we'll also open up for the rest of you to join our discussion. But before also, I was thinking there are two aspects in a sense of this discussion, and one is how do we understand the current state of affair? And in the call and the assumption that we have been discussing, the term crisis has been used, and as I've understood on the comments here, there is an unease of using crisis as a way that it is an unproductive term in a way to bring us forward. And the question is are there other terms of understanding our present situation that would be more productive in a sense than crisis? Because as Randi mentioned, we live in certain time, and there is something wrong with the world today in a sense. And if you listen also to the various keynotes, there is a strong sense that we are facing some large problems. But I'm also thinking here of the terms used by Diana Molinari. She was talking that we are experiencing an emotional regime of despair, and Marina Trostanova was talking about the futureless ontology, pointing to these as sort of some of our challenging, which also ties to the end of Randi. And also Miriam about imagining possible alternatives. How do we do that? How do we move on from understanding the present to how can that help us understanding different alternatives to the present? So does anyone want to start?
I mean, I think it's already, there are many really interesting questions. I just wanted to speak a little bit to what Randi said, because I think we're basically on the same, I think we're thinking very similarly in those ways. My question would be about the gap that you're talking about between the detachment from a future. We can hope for a future, but we can never know what it is, of course. But I think the idea of the term the speculative, right? And so I think of speculative fiction or not speculative realism, because that goes more to what you're saying, which is that it's something that we can never imagine and never reach. But speculative fiction, certainly, and again, speculative design, works with the idea of the near future. It's not the far future. It's a future that is not quite unknown. It's at the border of the known and the unknown. And so it does grasp onto things that are here and then uses those to produce a different future. It's not that we necessarily recognize entirely that future, but I think it's not entirely out of our grasp either. And this is it makes a distinction between the speculative and the utopic. So the utopic is in the far future, something that we hope for, but we obviously can never get to because that's the very definition of utopia. But the speculative is something that we can bring into being, that we can produce precisely because it works with things of the here and the now. And so in that case, I think of like the politics that go with prefigurative politics, right? So we don't know what is being figured and what can we amplify in that process to produce a different future. Again, it's not entirely knowable, but I do want to hang on to the fact that it's not entirely unknowable. And in that sense, I feel like then we have to tap into different affective regimes that are, I think that people have been bringing up. Obviously, Kim Tallberg today was about humor, but I think there's things about hopefulness, but hopeful anger, right? There's exuberance. There's other kinds of ways that we can engage with the present, I think, that are not, that aren't about despair or about kind of a Pollyanna-ish idea of positivities. But I think, again, I think what Diana said, I resist this idea of the regimes of despair, because I think it's exactly what you said, which is that what perspective is this coming from? People have been despairing for ages, and who defines what crisis is? I think then it's a kind of, it immediately shows a lack of understanding of what other people have been going through. So I think we can't despair. We just can't. I think it's unfair. I think it's privileged. I think it's, I mean, I'm not happy about this situation, but I feel like, okay, we got a deal.
Maybe to continue that and to pick up on what you said, Miriam, about the time being over for critique.
Not over. I think we can be speculative and critical at the same time.
Good. So maybe we do not disagree after all.
Critique plus.
Exactly, and we have a lot of ways of doing that within our feminist and queer vocabulary. And of course, queer critique has for a long time argued that it's the critique is also at the same time opening towards new futures or imaginaries or imagining. So it's, I mean, that's something we already have in our vocabulary, and I think within anthropology there are forms of critique and methodology that I relate to. For instance, Marilyn Straturn's recursivity, that's also one way of doing critique, which also at the same time I think does what you're talking about in also engaging in imagining, right? And I'm thinking about, hope as something that in particular we need to continue to engage critically, right? And of course in the field of migration, the governing of migration is very much taking place through the production and distribution of hope in particular ways. So migration authorities in different countries actively, try to destroy hope for particular categories of people. The Norwegian government has been running campaigns in Somalia, distributing cartoons with these very miserable, depicting these very miserable Somalis in Norway, how terrible it is to be there as an undocumented migrant, how miserable you will be, how you will not get health care, etc. So this very sort of concrete destruction of hope and the way in which hope is then distributed to some population and destroyed for others. And so we still need that move of criticality in dealing with these things.
Yes, is there okay, I can speak, okay. No, I was just thinking of your question about, is there like the understanding of this moment in time as a time of crisis, and is there a better way that we can understand it? It just made me think of how the word crisis is used these days politically, and how it's used to create action on different fronts and, purposes that we may agree or disagree with. For example, Donald Trump declaring that there is an emergency crisis situation at the border and therefore we must build the wall and we must, close down the entire state until this happens, And then on the other hand, I've seen that the Guardian now have decided to change the vocabulary that they use to talk. They don't want to say climate change anymore. They now want to say climate crisis or emergency because they feel like that reflects better, the need for action. So there's something in that word that's also very, very political and loaded, and different kinds of ideologies can tie onto it and use it. And I think there's a need to be critical also to how we use it. And
yeah, the solution is no. No, we're not finished yet. I think I just want to stress that we are faced with the dilemma. Okay, we can agree on we agree that it's still possible to be critical and to imagine a different future. But I think we need to take seriously the conflict or the dilemma between the imaginable alternatives and the non-imaginable, whatever we choose to call it, but the unimaginable in the imagination or the practice of imagining the future. So I think it is a serious dilemma that we have to deal with theoretically and not just jump to the conclusion or ignore this not. Because I think there is a risk when we imagine alternatives, possible alternatives, that these possibilities are confined within the present and that we close down the debate and those unimaginable possibilities beyond specific alternatives. I think there's a tendency to talk too much about alternatives. Part of the critical practice would be then to open up this space.
Yes, let's continue on alternatives. Because what I'm also thinking of the discussion that have been here and also that I've been hearing during the rest of the conference, has been mentioned this need for rethinking futures, rethinking alternatives. There's been some suggestions for where they can be found, like Miriam has talked about the feminist commons. Diana Molinari was talking about that we need to sort of cultivate the scholarship of hope. Marina Klostanova, drawing on Maria Lugones, talked about deep coalitions, how to bring about the deep coalitions. Ragnar Kukkonen talked about post-state indigenous feminist sovereignty as lived practice. So I was thinking maybe we should to talk about where sort of both on what terms do we rethink the political and where do we understand change coming from? And here is the relation between rethinking these issues from an academic perspective and lived practice. Because what struck me with many of these suggestions is that they come from an engagement with alternatives as lived practice, more than necessarily an engagement with feminist academic thought. Because feminist approaches has been engaged with sort of rethinking another way of society from the start. And there's been many attempts of doing it, but I was just thinking that how these suggestions were very much related to sort of lived practices, and I was wondering if anyone would like to sort of have a comment on that, on the relation, not only between critique and solutions, but also the role of academic rethinking and its relation to lived practice.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, Marianne, that this is important to discuss. And I was just thinking, what do we mean by being creative, and what's the role of concepts and conceptualizations? And if for instance, Liz Gross would argue that we need concepts that can bring us beyond the possibilities inscribed in the present, and that's what I mean. The concepts are there to deal with what is not known and knowable, and I think that's really different from being engaged with empirical alternatives in the present. So I think we should take seriously this as this is really something we need to talk about. What you mean by reconceptualization?
At the risk of becoming of backtracking too much from this need of new imaginative practices, I was thinking of Butler's earlier work on and discussion of Les Mariages pour tous, so the French debates around what is often called gay marriage, or marriage for everyone, as it's called in France, where she elaborates on the notion of criticality and talks about this sort of, I don't remember what she calls it, a sort of performative dilemma that we cannot escape, in the sense that we need both to work on the register of working for and claiming rights and recognition for people of different genders and sexualities within the existing frame of state and law, at the same time as we risk this criticality of opening to the unknown of what there might be beyond those categories that we can't grasp within that particular framework of naming. And I think, at least in the field of migrations, or what I work with, the topic of irregular migration, this is a contradiction that we have to relate to, that there are nation states that can give recognition and rights of migrants who are irregularized and who are precarized by this system. So we need to be able to address that within the existing sort of frame of it, and at the same time be able to move beyond it by opening the imagination. So I think I'm sort of still insisting on this, staying with the criticality in a sense, in both senses.
Yeah, I think this is a really important and difficult question as well, and I don't really know what to say about it, except that I think that actually this maybe sound very trivial, but I think academic Twitter is a place that I really think a lot of interesting things are going on with this regard, where people are, especially American academics, are working out the relationships between their academic practice and their lived experiences, and there's a lot of, I would say, theorizing actually going on in that space, and I think it's really worthwhile. Like, I learned so much from following these debates. I think, and one of the things that particularly stand out to me is how people are speaking about their double position as maybe an academic and at the same time somebody who doesn't traditionally have a place in academia. So there's a lot of people talking about how, you know, there are women, there are people of color, there are queer and so on, and making their, you know, way into the academic world and talking about those experiences. So on the one hand, being part of this production of, you know, legitimate knowledge and so on, but also speaking from a kind of marginalized position, or the subject position you are speaking from is not necessarily so recognized by your peers and so on. And I know the dilemmas that this creates, but also there's so much imaginative work going on in that space, I think, of how academia could be different and how society could be different and more inclusive, and to be combining, I think, this imaginative work with critical work. Yeah.
Thanks. I just want to be clear what I meant by critique and going beyond critique. I certainly agree that we need to continue undoing structures of power and exposing them and denaturalizing and complicating common sense. I mean, to me, all of that, the critique and feminist critique is absolutely critical. So I totally agree with that. But then I think also because of the tension, I think that Randy has pointed out between critiquing and then opening up to the entirely unknown, you know, that you want to both open the way, and then you open the way to something that could be more horrible than you ever imagined, right? I mean, so it's both. So I guess to me, that's why I want to speak to that in-between space, which is that you critique and you open, but opening is not enough. I think opening is really important, but I do think then you have to help things become. We have to become together and create that process and help build it, and yet be always recursively aware of when you're closing things down and try to open it up again. But I think concept work is absolutely that, and you know, it's creative and it changes the world. And I don't think it's disengaged. I think, as you just said, I don't think it's disengaged from empirical work. I think of the work I have been doing with sanctuary activists. And we got together and we had several workshops on the concept of sanctuary, you know, and trying to push it and trying to think politically where it might go, where it was open, where it was not. And it was based on their empirical and some of our empirical work, but theirs in a much more, I think, the people who were doing it day in and day out in a very engaged sense of how it worked and when it didn't. So I think it was creative because of people's empirical and clear engagements with it, and yet we needed to also amplify and help people. We had to work together to create new concepts to then bring them out and push them out into the world. So I think it's, yeah, I think it goes, you know, there's both places, we have to, I think that's our role as academics, is definitely concept work, and that's one of the creative things, but there's other things we can do as well, and I think they have to be informed by empirical work at the same time.
Okay, I think we should open up if someone in the audience also have questions or comments. Fortunately, we only have one microphone, so I'll try to run back and forth between you. So here is the first, and yeah, I know this one more. So please, up there, that's Benny. Should we take one and one, or should we just, I think we take these three now, and then you have a chance to yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for this very stimulating debate or conversation between you. It struck many chords with me. I think it's some of the concerns that I think you addressed really well some of the concerns that I've been thinking about lately as well. And I think especially now in this last part of the conversation, you came to some sort of core issue, I think, with regards not just to what is happening in this current moment, but also the role of academia and our role as feminist or gender scholars. And I think that from what you said, at least my interpretation of it is that we need a different kind of academic practice. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. What kind of academic practice do we need to address these challenges that you've been talking about?
Thank you. I think we have quite a lot of time, so I think it's good to directly engage so that you get time for each of the questions. Does anyone feel like they want to start? What kind of academic practice? Okay, then we'll take the other question while you all think about this question.
I have two questions for you. At least I have two comments. Thank you. I was thinking about the term crisis, and crisis, we can deconstruct the word crisis, of course, and it's always this thing. Some people are in crisis and some people help them, part of the humanitarian discourse and so on and so forth. But I was also struck with what Margit was pointing out to, that the term crisis is very forceful in kind of like creating action, or might be very forceful in creating action. So instead maybe of just deconstructing it, critiquing it, finding a new concept, if there are other words, ways of working with the very concept of crisis to make it work differently in the world. And I was also thinking, because it's quite obvious for me that we are in a crisis, especially concerning ecological crisis, climate crisis, but that is everybody's crisis, right? We are in the same crisis together, although we are completely differently situated within that crisis. So instead of like switching the word, try to rethink then who is the subject of the crisis, right? That we are all subjects of the crisis, just differently situated. So that was one of the things I wanted to point out, and I think that leads into the other comment that I also had, is what does it mean to do this concept work? Because when like turning to Elizabeth Grosz, of course, like one of the ways she's doing it is just always kind of going back to other concepts, older concepts, trying to figure out, okay, what can we learn from reading these in new terms? And that also leads me into this thinking about like, okay, how do we imagine differently? How can we create alternatives? And I'm completely agreeing with Randi on this kind of like, okay, we have to imagine an alternative possible world. But there's also a different tradition in thinking imagination. For example, not come as a surprise, from Gayatri Spivak's word, where she's not talking about creating new possible words, but exactly the not yet imagined impossible future. And in order to kind of like think along those terms, what is really needed is a close reading of what we have, or what we did have, or what we cannot see in what we already have. And I think that's also a point with Elizabeth Grosz when she's turning to Darwin, in trying to think of like, how can we think change, this irreversible pull towards futurity, which is evolution, which is history, then the future is always embedded in the present in some ways, but in some ways that we cannot really foretell, and that will create monsters, will create completely different things that we cannot imagine, and that seems impossible for us. But that's also a way of, I'm sorry, I'll have to stop soon. That is also a way of thinking the relationship between critique and imagination, because it's this close reading of what we have, those possibilities in what we have that we don't see, that might be able to open up for impossible futures. So yeah, but that's a little bit different tradition. I just wanted to point to. Thank you.
So I have two more on the list, but I think no, you are ready, so you can start.
I still don't. Thank you for those questions and comments, Thomas. I think it's such a big question and a different kind of academic practice, but already to start with, different from what? Because I think we have a lot of different academic practices. So there is not one academic practice that we can start from and say it needs to be different from that. Huh? So your question is a little bit tricky in that sense, and I think that these last days here at the conference has shown that there is an immense spectrum of what counts for academic practice in gender studies and feminism, right? We've seen a lot of different examples of, latest today with the keynote speech, where these kinds of performances of, that are staged are also part of academic practice or academic practice. And then on the other hand, I find it myself extremely difficult to forge these academic practices that I would sort of find more ethically and politically and even epistemologically rewarding in a sense, or acceptable. And so right now, for instance, I'm writing. I'm trying to write something together with one of my interlocutors in fieldwork, an undocumented migrant, and we're trying to write a text together. And you could say that's a different form of academic practice. I'm not writing for a journal, I'm not trying to publish on this. And it's a way of creating some sort of common narrative or working through these things together. It's extremely challenging. It's so difficult. But yes, I mean, we can work with ways in which we can practice differently as academics. So I'm looking forward to hear what the others has to say on that. Crisis is very forceful in creating action, and I must admit that right now that scares me mostly. And I mean, we talked about this before. So the now sort of claim to a climate emergency and claims that since politicians have proved that they cannot cope with this at a level of democratic policy, we need to somehow bypass those democratic institutions and have some sort of direct citizen action, right? This is happening at the same time as we see anti-authoritarian movements all over Europe and the US. So to me, that's primarily frightening. Also that there has been a suggestion now, both in the UK and in Norway, and I'm sure elsewhere, to reframe the climate crisis as a war. To say that we're in a war. And that is precisely also to try to address the importance and to get the action moving to face, what it would be like if we were in a war. I find that as well extremely problematic. So I'm sort of sticking with Miriam here that I cannot think with you at this point of crisis being productive of anything that does not embody the risk of authoritarianism loudly and clearly. Yes, I'll stop there.
Okay, I think with regards to the academic practices, I think that's a really important question as well. And like Christina said, it's really difficult to imagine like what we can do in a way. But I have some concrete suggestions that I have picked up from the academic Twitter, as I mentioned beforehand. So a lot of these will apply specifically to the American contexts where these discussions are mainly going on, but I think a lot of them also apply to us in Europe. So I think, one of the things that they talk about in these discussions is how, for example, class is excluding a lot of people, like economic problems exclude a lot of people from doing all the things you need to do to become a successful academic in a way. So in order to create academic conversations with more diverse participants, one of the things that one can do is to not make education so incredibly expensive as it is in the United States. And also, for example, more relevant to us as well, not make conferences so incredibly expensive, like to attend important conferences in your discipline. So I'm an anthropologist, I read a lot of these discussions in anthropology, and they say, for example, in the United States, it's really important to attend the American Anthropological Association's conference. And a lot of job interviews and so on happen there. And it's really important for networking and getting jobs and so on. I don't know if you can confirm this, but also it's incredibly difficult economically to do it. And also there's a problem then of, people not being paid advances so they have to charge everything to their credit cards, and then they don't get, the refund until the credit card bill comes, or, not in time, and so on. So that's one set of problems that could be done differently. Another problem that I think is very relevant, probably everywhere, is the discrimination of scholars that are not, from white middle-class academic backgrounds, that come to academia from different societal positions and do not feel at home, do not have the habitus in a way that you're supposed to inhabit to make it and to be successful, and also struggle to find their place and maybe find that their voices are not appreciated, that their ideas are appropriated by others, and so on. Other ways that people are discussing that academia could be different is to decolonize the curriculum, to rethink the canon of what kind of texts we need to read, how do we teach them, and so on. And also, of course, the whole, who is the subject of study and who is the person studying, which is another power technique, in a way that a lot of indigenous American academics are talking about, how they constantly feel that they find this attitude among their colleagues that they, as indigenous, it would be more appropriate for them to be objects of study rather than the professors doing the studying. So all of those things, I think, are concrete ways in which academia could engage in more imaginary work, or creating a different kind of knowledge production. About the word crisis, I also agree it's a really strong word, and I haven't really thought through all the implications that it means, but I think it's worth having that discussion about what it contains and what are the potentials of using it, and is it possible that it can be used not only to create authoritarian situations or not? I don't know. I haven't really thought enough about that to answer it properly.
Yeah, thanks for the great questions. To your question about academic practices, I agree with what Christina, there's a whole lot out there, and it depends where one comes from, but for me, it has been, I have had to rethink my methods, my methodologies, and I think, to me, again, I like the way Rancière puts it, that, that there's a realm of the sensible, and that to change our politics, you have to change our aesthetics. So you have to kind of bring something else into the realm of the sensible in order to be able to enact it. That's where political engagement then comes from. So to me, I feel like I have to engage with the aesthetic realm. I have to engage with the sensible and help bring it into being. So to me, that requires collaborative and interdisciplinary forms of collaboration with artists and designers and people who imagine in different ways and make things in the way I don't know how to. And so that's been a really, I might be able to give a history of borders, or I might be able to give a history of immigration, and they can help me think it through the question of space and object and aesthetics, and how it becomes a problem aesthetically before it becomes a problem politically, right? So I think it's a different way to enter into it, the photograph or the image can be an analytic, not just a representation. And to me, that's where I feel like I need to understand. I feel like innocence is produced by the image. It's not just representing it. It is actually produced as that. And I had to learn that, right? So then we were talking about, so how do you then produce an image of non-innocence? Can an image do that? What kind of form? How can I materialize that? So to me, that's a kind of methods I think I need to engage in differently. And in terms of crisis, I think I agree with what everybody has said, forceful, but just like humanitarianism is forceful, but produces and circumscribes and forecloses possibilities when it acts. So anyway, I also think that the book Anti-Crisis by Janet Roisman is something that talks about the temporal ruptures that crisis as a concept presumes, right? She draws on Koselleck. And I feel like, to me, then it forecloses all the all the continuities, all the histories, all the things that were there. So why is it a crisis now? What rupture, what event does that presume, and does it create, and what does it rupture with? And to me, that is problematic. I feel like, yes, we're all in shit, but why is it a crisis? It's bad, it is. So in any case, to the point of imagination, of the not yet imagined, completely, 100% in agreement. It's what nourishes your imagination, and why, of course, the past nourishes imagination, right? And I did a project with a bunch of students, and again, some curator, and we went back, we thought about the relationships between Cambodia, France, and the US, and thinking of imperial relationships. And they went back and tried to create futures that had been foreclosed. And so it was an imaginative, alternate futurographies. What got foreclosed when that genocide happened? What narratives and struggles had been there that got cut off that could now be nourished and reimagined? So I agree with you 100% that imagination is not about some impossible future, but it's always nourished from our pasts, excavating and going back to the things. I don't think we can do anything otherwise.
But I also wanted to point out that there's so many different ways of thinking crisis, and we can just ditch this as a term. But if we want to use it as a term, there is a lot of other places we can go to see a different genealogy. And I just wanted to point to one thing is how crisis is used in pedagogy. That when you experience a pedagogical crisis, is because there's something there that you can't grasp because it can't fit into the structure of your subjectivity. And then you come in a crisis. And in order to get further, you have to kind of like reorganize how you then try to understand what it is that you cannot understand. I think that could be a very fruitful way of thinking crisis in this time. Yeah, but I won't say anything more about that.
I don't think it changes anything for me. It is precisely this idea that there's a rupture, that there's something that you can't, as you said, can't understand or digest or something. And to me then the question of positionality comes in there. Who can't digest it and why? And I think there'll be other people out there who can. Or other things. So, I mean, it's a question, is it impossible to digest for all of us, or impossible to enter, or is it just the liberal white imagination that doesn't have space for it? So.
Yeah, I think that, well, I also, I just respond to Kari first, and Thomas, some indirectly responds to Thomas as well. But I think what I would like to add to the discussion is that potential novelty or change can be conceptualized outside the notion of the event or the extraordinary event. So, which means that we need not wait for an exceptional event to reveal some other possibilities for existence. So that will be kind of contrary to Deleuze or contrary to Gross and others in that same vein. But I think Elizabeth Povinelli asks quite a decisive question when she asks how we might turn from an ontology of potentiality to a sociology of potentiality, and I think that is a very foundational question that speaks to, you know, the notion of possibility, and imaginable and unimaginable, and that potentiality is always embodied in specific social worlds. So I guess that's indirectly also a response to Thomas, because it deals with work of conceptualization in relation to the to that which is embodied in specific social worlds. But it doesn't mean that we can't use the concept of crisis. It just means that, we can define crisis in that framing instead of, associating crisis always already with a radical event or something that is a radical rupture.
Okay, I have 3 people, if more people, yeah, 4. And I think we are, we start with the first 2 and then I'll see what the clock is.
Thank you. I just wanted to share with you, especially since this is mostly a Norwegian panel, part of our research history. Maybe you are quite aware of it, but in Norway, in the 80s, there was a project called Alternative Future. It was very much a bottom-up project. It was a Nordic from the beginning. It was started by a number of mostly environmental organizations because of the then thought crisis in the environmental issues. And this project was finally able to have the Norwegian Storting fund project Alternative Future. And the grassroots activists, they wanted to work with researchers to help formulate alternatives. And the Storting, they really also wanted to find alternatives because they didn't have any answers themselves. So I happened to be one of the researchers recruited to the project. And one of the things that we did with the activists was to have all these future, what is it in English? The future workshops, which is a wonderful kind of practicality. We also, the Idébanken, Bank of Ideas was established. Grønn hverdag, green everyday daily life was established. Lots of things. It was Ingvar Løken, Paul Strandbakken, Kjell Dale, and lots of other people in this work. Myself, I had the pleasure of working with Feminist Utopias, and I also worked with Ernst Bloch's conceptualization of abstract and realistic utopias. Quite useful concepts, I thought. And today I would also like to mention Gudrun Ekblad, who was a psychologist. She had funding to work out utopia called, I think her novel or book is called Det andre landet, in the other country, in which she uses her academic experience in order to try to, fantasize an alternative ways of living. Now this project, after some years, was institutionalized in the Research Council. And what happens then? Of course, it had to be assessed according to strict academic criteria. Ottar Brox was one of the persons that assessed the project, and it was thumbs down. And I think that the assessment committee, they thought that it was much more important to identify the dark spots in the near future, whereas this project was kind of envisioning, where to go. So, thank you.
Thank you all for your inputs. I would just like to maybe keep this like an open question or comment to everyone. But it's interesting when you're talking about imagining possibilities without closing up for the future and future discussion. It comes to my mind then this saying that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, which is kind of what I think a little bit of an elephant in the room, that we kind of need to imagine a world without capitalism to actually face these challenges. And that also comes into mind the immense powerful force of prefigurative politics. So Miriam, you're talking about the commons, and I'm sorry to say that I missed your lecture, but when I'm thinking of that, I'm thinking of different ways of community organizing and social centers and mutual aid. That's what I'm thinking of, but you might comment on that. And then the open question then would be, shouldn't we also recognize the very important inspiration that the politics, the radical politics of the libertarian left and anarchist tradition has brought forward? How we instead of creating a blueprint for the future that we have to slavishly enforce, we can instead imagine the future right here and now. I think I should maybe keep myself short so people have time to answer, but I think that was probably all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll take the other question, because I'm afraid when I give you the microphone, I don't get it back.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this highly interesting discussion. And my question is much more on the concrete, my comment is much more on the concrete level. So these are very important things that you bring up. But I'll say it anyway, because it links to Thomas' question. And I was thinking, because what you're talking about, Miriam, to imagine futures and like altering the sensible evidences. And you point out some concrete ways of doing that in your project, working with speculative architects, and I'm thinking, and this has been a topic addressed in several speakers, as Marianne said, and I think that what we're not then talking about is if we really mean that, if that's a way to answer Thomas' question, we should also think about what kind of sense, where are we changing these sensible evidences? Because I've been myself engaged for many years working with architects and designers, imagining these kind of things, and you seldom, and then of course you change the way of thinking in the room where you do these things, but when you communicate with the broader public, that's when it gets dirty, and that's when it gets tiring, and then you stop perhaps after 5 years because it's only fruitful for yourself or the public. And when we teach students at the School of Architecture, thinking about power, thinking about Rancière's conceptualization, one of the important things is to say to the students that, okay, now you have imagined this, and you have reconceptualized, and you have tried to alter the sensible evidences, but what happens when you go out from the school? So I think this is the things that if we're going to think in these directions and use a lot of time on conferences, we have to go into the concrete matter. Where will it lead us?
Thank you very much for an engaging discussion. I work with speculative fiction, and I greatly enjoyed this sort of thread at this conference about the importance of alternative or other political imaginaries or ethical imaginaries. And I've been very inspired in my own work by Nero Yuval Davis and Marcel Stolzer, who talk about a situated imagination. And I'm just curious, because in your discussion of crisis, there is this situatedness and location, politics of location, but isn't there also a risk when we talk about imagination and imagining that we make it into a universalized we? So I just want to hear your thoughts about that.
Okay. Who of you wants to go first? I mean, you can start with one question, and if you need to think more of the other one, then you can get the microphone back.
Thanks for such excellent questions. Just to your point, I 100% agree. To me, the Commons is primarily anti-capitalist. It's against private property. It's against enclosures. It has to do away with it. You can't have a world that shares the commons and capitalism. And ultimately, I would say it does away with states and sovereignty as well. So I think, and yes, obviously anarchists are busy doing that in various forms, and I think a lot of feminist anarchists and so on. So to me, I don't know, there are a lot of questions that those projects raise, and about scale and about difference and about all kinds of things like that. But to me, it's ultimately and fundamentally about including people, about being non-exclusionary. That's the basis, right? And so that you don't have to like anybody, you can have the stranger, you don't have to get to know them. The one thing you have to have is an agreement that everybody can participate. And there will be people who slack off, and there will be whatever, that's a thing to deal with. But I totally 100% agree with you. Thank you for the Alternate Futures project, and the idea that it was shut down is not surprising to me. And I guess part of the question I think that you were dealing with too is how do you do this in a neoliberal, in a world where there's certain kinds of outcomes, expected all the time. So, I think we can have some kinds of outcomes, and I think that comes to your question is how do you translate it into the public? To me, that's also a question of how do you translate any form of education into the public, what you learn, what we teach any of our students, what do they go out and do, and how do they transform the world with what we teach them, right? But, insofar as you're saying, okay, certainly academic books are not going to be read by most people, to me there are forms of, and I think it's more than just learning the tricks of the trade of somebody else's discipline or learning how to be an architect. I think it's about architects, designers, anthropologists, literary scholars, transcending and creating something else together that neither of them master. And so what does that look like? It has to take multiple forms, obviously. And I agree with you that it's hard to travel into the world, but what forms travel? And it's also about transforming a world so that we can see new forms and recognize new forms, not just fit into the slots that are already there, right? So you might have an exhibit that travels, you might have a short story that travels, right? You might have an op-ed, you might have a song, but I do also think that changing the realm of the sensible is changing how we notice things and how things can travel and what things strike us and what doesn't. But of course it's the hard work, as you said, of reaching a larger public. I hold deeply to the fact that just because one doesn't reach a huge, large public, that somebody's transformation can lead to somebody else's and somebody else's, right? That it can be a local process. Situated imagination, thank you, speculative fiction, I love. I think, to me, it's exactly working with, I started with Margaret Atwood, and thinking of what she calls herself as social science fiction, right? Because she really starts with where we are and moves from there. But I totally agree, and that's the question of the commons too, is how do you do it without creating a universal and homogeneous we in the process? I don't know why it has to be that. I think we can speculate on many futures, right? We don't have to create one for everybody. Yeah. I don't know, maybe you can say more what you think the danger is in that.
Right now? Well, there's a new wave in science fiction, for example, where you have lots of previously marginalized positions writing African futurism, for example, and even from trans perspectives.
Yeah.
There's a lot of voices coming from the margins, making different, or making alternative futures, but they are common alternative futures. So there's just this interesting, I don't know, I'm just interested in how imagination becomes a universalized word, whereas it's also located and situated.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
These bodily and social worlds.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, totally agree. And I think that was the. To me, again, it's what nourishes your imagination, not that. And you're right. Maybe we just need to get rid of the idea of or break down what we mean by imagination. But to me, we all have very different things that nourish, and there's not one way to get there. Everybody has different situated places they start from. So yes, I agree completely with Afrofuturism, and I think I've been reading indigenous speculative fiction, which I think is really fantastic too.
Yeah, I agree with much of what has been already said. So I just want to add that when thinking about commons, I think it's also, or what Ingvild, what you said about the risk or the kind of creation of a exclusionary we and the risk of just expanding that we, I think, is always a risk. So maybe we need to also then discuss commons or the potentialities, future potentialities beyond the subject, and we haven't really discussed much this now, but I think it's important to not to lose this capacity to see beyond the subject when engaging with these questions, and not just continue to expand human rights and so on, expand the we.
Yes, yeah, I think much of my thoughts as well has already been said, but yeah, I think with the Feminist Future project, I think this is a really good example of how, sometimes there's a clash between maybe the academic ideals and what we would like for our research to do sometimes, and working out how to reconcile that, and everything that you mentioned now in this neoliberal era of what is expected as an outcome, and how a project should be phrased and so on, is a challenge. And I think what you said about it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, I think is really powerful, because it speaks to how strongly embedded we are in these structures, and it's so difficult to imagine capitalism somehow not being there, structuring everything. And also I think that it kind of limits our imaginations with regards to the commons, or what can we imagine, or how would it happen, who would give up their house first, in a sense, like how would it happen in practical terms. It creates so many questions as to what's possible and what's not, and what just becomes an impossible dream or utopia, and what could actually be achieved. So I think there is so much to think about that, and this also, of course, relates to your question about like the teaching, and how do we, the students, how do they bring what they are, if they learn and experience in their education how to create more inclusive architecture, for example. Like how does that travel into the world of when they get a job, and that goes for anybody in a way. Like how do you, if you come to a new place of work and you're the first person who want to do things completely differently, and how does that work for you in that place, and the exhaustion that you mentioned, and also I've heard I read something about climate change once, that the reason why it's so difficult to change people's opinion about climate change denial and science denial and so on is that our opinions are embedded in relationships. So basically, to put it a bit bluntly, like if you change your opinions, you need to change your friends in a way. So this also, in the place of work, it would also be very difficult to be the only one thinking, a different vision. So I think that's a work that everybody who's interested in making these changes need to also take into the public space, I think. And also I think in terms of the risks of creating a universal we, I think it's definitely important to get beyond that, because that the whole idea of everybody having to become or somehow be or think the same is also holds potential for authoritarianism, I think. So how to embody all these different subject positions in a common future. Yeah, I don't know exactly how to bring it to a conclusion, but yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah, I don't think I have so much to add anymore. Very interesting comments. Thank you. Maybe just a little comment to Ingvild's question. Thank you for that. I think that if we want to speak about situated imagination or situated imagining, we also need to think situatedness not only as spatial but also as temporal. And I think that sort of a problem of the whole sort of conversation we're having is that we very easily sort of slip into these configurations of past, present, and future and sort of take them for granted in our discussions. And we talk about, you know, sort of different futurities. We do talk about that, but we somehow still seem to, there is some sort of, you know, underlying assumption that we're all in the same time. So again, back to what I started off with, the times of crisis, are we all situated in the same time? And if we are to think seriously about temporal multiplicity, then what does that do to the need to imagine futures differently? So there is something there.
Yes, we have time for one or two quick more questions. I have one hand, and please give me a sign if anyone else wants the word.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really inspiring. I guess my comment sort of ties onto both comment on crisis and the comment on capitalism, because it strikes me how crisis was such a central concept for Marx in his theory of capitalism. And at that point, I would suggest perhaps that for Marx, crisis was a hopeful concept. It was how he imagined the end of capitalism. So it's kind of just, I guess, interesting to note as that at the same time as we lose hope in the concept of crisis, as I hear you guys, it's at the same, well, it sort of coincides in time with the loss of this, like the imagination of the end of capitalism. So there's, I guess I thought that was sort of interesting to hear how you talked, and also that the capitalism was sort of lost from the conversation of crisis, and Marx was not out of the conversation of crisis. Yeah, I can't formulate a question, I'm sorry, but that's a comment.
Yes, is there any last, yeah, up here?
So while I was listening to this, and this has been really, really interesting, I went and looked at the root of the word crisis is decision. It's like a decision point. And I'm wondering whether the idea of crisis as it's been used is the idea of sort of, there's like an option of returning to some sort of stability versus sort of moving, or the idea that we are constantly undergoing change. And that crisis is used to mobilize forces to kind of reenact the familiar and the stable rather than to move into the change as a decision point. And so that's just kind of a thought that I'd be curious as to where you might take it.
Okay. These will be your final comments as well. So if you have anything last word, you also use this opportunity. Who wants to go first?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, and Marx, like you said about this, you know, crisis as something hopeful because it brings the end of capitalism. I think this also relates to, and also the second question or comment about crisis as bringing about something new as a way to mobilize and so on. I think a lot of people who have studied crisis also talk about these perspectives. And also, this is something that I've seen in my own empirical work, that crisis can bring about really different outcomes for different people. So, both in my work in Brazil and also work I've done in Guatemala previously, I've seen how crisis and the mobilization it brings about, for some people really, you know, it brings about a moment of really, you know, creativity and repositioning and learning new skills that bring about new opportunities later on and so on. So I think there's definitely, the word crisis also does, and the reality of crisis also does contain that. And on the other hand, there are also people who have come out of those very same situations in a situation of complete, devastation. So I think it contains all of that, and I think that's what makes it so difficult to use, analytically as well, because it has so many, it contains so many different experiences, and as a concept as well is really complex. And I don't really know. I don't have a conclusion to bring about it. I just think, it also contains all of those things. Yeah.
Thanks for the comment about capitalism and crisis and Marx. Totally. The only thing I would say is that, of course, Marx had a linear view of history and a stadial view of history, and and that's why he could imagine crisis that way, because it would get us, outside of history into. And I think that is what we no longer believe, or at least I don't, as much as I love Marx. And so I feel like in that sense, crisis does do the work that you were talking about, which is try to get us, if we are not returning to a place of stability, get us to a place outside of time in some senses, outside, into a place of stability or normality or something. And that's why I find it problematic. And I agree with what was said here before, that, the commons is not, as much as it's not, it's impossible to imagine, it's also very possible to imagine because it's being enacted around us. And I think it's just working with that and amplifying it, not waiting for a crisis or something to happen in order to do that, to imagine something impossible. It's working with what we have. So you don't need a linear view of history for that, I don't think. And to the point of, I think you've said it so nicely about why I find the idea difficult, the idea of crisis, even though I completely agree there are many genealogies to it. To me, I think of it also in terms, it's not the same as the concept of emergency, but there are many overlaps. And you think of humanitarian emergency, which presumes a before and an after. Again, it presumes that there is an emergency, a rupture that needs to be responded to, and an emergency in a world order where there's supposedly peace before, then there's emergency and you go back to peace. That is just not that's not a description of our world. And I think we have made it seem like it's a description of our world, and it just is not. It erases the realities of most of the world. So I find both emergency and crisis take us away from the kind of work, the important political projects that need to be going on.
Well, I acknowledge that there's different ways of conceptualizing crisis, although maybe the most common way of doing it is to think of it like you said, that it has to do with re-establishing continuity, like Wendy Brown, when writing about the relationship between crisis and critique, and others have done that as well, emphasizing the idea of deliberation, analyzing the situation in order to re-establish continuity. But there are, of course, other ways as well, like Bataille would have a totally different take on crisis and relating it to another etymological tradition, and conceptualize it more, like Bataille would do. And Marx, again, and there are many different discussions, of course, of how Marx conceptualized history, and obviously post-colonial theorists have picked up some ideas from Marx relating to history and heterotemporality, like Chakrabarty, and the distinction in Capital between History 1 and History 2. So I think we shouldn't really, we should acknowledge that there are different ways of conceptualizing crisis, and then we can have our own preferences. But but I think my point is that we should be aware of how we conceptualize crisis.
Yeah, again, I don't know if I have anything to add to what my colleagues have said here. Thanks to all of you. I think that the etymology of crisis as decision is, of course, interesting, but it's also problematic, as several people have stressed here, because it's also this this connection still to the decision as an act on a situation without the normals, or related to that, still to that understanding of crisis as a rupture or as outside of normality. And just to say that I think also that to me the notion of crisis, for instance, in relation to the domain that I work in on migration, as it functions now, it's hiding the way in which the current border regimes and ways of governing migration are producing particular effects, and speaking about it as a crisis, either a humanitarian crisis or a crisis of security or migration crisis, it's hiding this, the relations of production. That is really the current border regime and the way it works. So in that sense, I think we need other ways of talking about what's going on so that we can locate that production where it actually belongs and is taking place.
Okay. Then I think the only thing left to do is thank you all for making this a highly interesting discussion.